Okay, so hello everyone. Today I'll be taking a very short, very introductory lecture on Russian formalism. So, Russian formalism is a movement that came up in Russia and it lasted from 1915 until 1929. It had a rather abrupt end, which we'll look at, and these were due to political circumstances rather than the popularity of the movement itself. But it came up in 1915 and it was primarily a reaction against a lot of metaphysical abstractions uh, and other forms of what they thought was vagueness that pervaded the symbolist movement in Russia at the time. It was also felt that literary history, or the study of literary history in Russia, was heavy with, or was rather too heavy with, psychological and historical and biographical features, which sort of took away from the literature that they were studying itself. So, in order to do away with it, or to move away with it and look at the text itself, the Russian formalists came up with a movement which called Russian formalism, which they did not term, but was rather a term given to them by the opponents of the movement. But they advocated for a movement that would focus only on the literary text, and not just on the text, but on the literary devices and the form in which a text was written. Now, when I say that the name Russian formalism was something that was primarily given, sorry, one second. Yeah, when I say that the name Russian formalism was primarily given by the opponents of the movement, what I mean is it was given to the two groups called the Opohaz and the Moscow Linguistic Circle. And the Opohaz is a society for study of poetic language, and the Moscow Linguistic Circle was a group that focused primarily on linguistics in literature, not just in language, but primarily in literature. And both of these groups advocated this movement where you focus primarily on literary text and on literary devices. And together, their activities came to be called the Russian formalist movement. Okay. Moving on, so this is how the movement came up, and it was one of the first movements that trended towards a very structural analysis of literary devices in a text, or of the text itself, and not just of the literary devices, but also of the cultural phenomena that were a part of the text. So, in this sense, the Russian formalists focus. The Russian formalists and their focus on literary devices and how they function in a text is a point of difference between them and the new critics, which came up around the same time in England and in Cambridge specifically. We've seen these about how F.R. Leavis and I.A. Richards and William Empson and all the rest of them. But the new critics were primarily focused on the text and on keeping out any external context whatsoever. So the new critics advocated looking at the text in the absence of a context, or not just in the absence of a context, deliberately doing away with the context to see what meaning the text itself held. The Russian formalists were not so very focused on the context. To be certain, they did not want undue emphasis on it, but they did focus on literary devices used and how the usage of certain literary devices produced a certain effect, and why those literary devices were ever used in the first place. So this is a basic point of difference between the Russian formalists and the new critics. Now, the main people in Russian formalism, or the ones that we read most popularly, are Viktor Shklovsky. His essay Art is Technique we've already seen. Jan Mukharovsky, Boris Eichenbaum, who has very perceptive and insightful comments, and Roman Jakobson, who is by far the most popular and the most widely read of the four. Jakobson has an essay called Linguistics in poetics, which is where a lot of which sort of uh, set forth pretty clearly what the Moscow Linguistic Circle and the OPAs were doing, in a sense. Okay, so let's move on to look at some features of Russian formalism. Russian formalism states that literature has certain characteristics and certain features that make it different from ordinary language. So you see how they deviate from, we could say, Wordsworth, because Wordsworth says that poetic language is most definitely ordinary language, except it passes through reflection and thought before it becomes poetry. But essentially, it is the language of the common man. It is everyday ordinary language. But Russian formalism doesn't say that. Russian formalism says that literature or language used in literature, specifically in poetry, is a language all by itself and which is far removed from ordinary language. And this is because poetic or literary language has certain features or certain characteristics which make it extremely different and which hold different meanings in the poetic context. It focuses on the literary devices or tools that make up the text, or it sees a text as being made up of not just the plot or the story or the character, but of devices and tools of alliterations and meters and rhymes, let's say, for example. And this is what gives a literary text its status of being a literary text. This is what they argue. Therefore, a focus on form and how the literary devices do what it is they do, or their function, rather than a focus on the content is key to this movement, because the content would mean focusing on the plot, on the character, on how the narrative progresses, and why is the plot weak, and things like that. But the formalists aren't concerned with those. They're concerned with the language used to describe them, or the manner or the structure in which encompasses all of these events. The events are not exactly immaterial, but the events are subordinate to the form, which means that the content is subordinate to the form here. This is how they began. Okay. Keeping in mind that the formalists focused on form rather than on content when they started out, later on towards the end of the movement, they attempted a synthesis of the two, but in the beginning their focus was exclusively on form, and they believed that content was encapsulated in the form. And keeping this in mind, they had about 2 to 3 features that is seen as their greatest legacy today. One of them is defamiliarization, or ostraniny in Russian. That's the term they use. I'm not sure of the pronunciation, but it's roughly translated as defamiliarization or as making strange. Now, this technique is, to put it in simple terms, is to make strange the object of perception so as to enhance perception. Now, what does this mean? This means that using poetic language or using literary language, because remember, literary language is different from ordinary language. So not just the mere usage of literary language, but using literary language to describe something that we are all familiar with. So describing the familiar in unfamiliar terms is what defamiliarization is, because it enhances a reader's perception, or it makes you think about the reality that you see every single day in different terms, in very new terms, which I think it was Eichenbaum or Jacobson, I'm not very sure, which a lot of the formalists equated to pulling the grayness away from one's eyes. This is what defamiliarization does. It makes unfamiliar what is very, very familiar. Yeah. Okay. That is one. The second one is called literariness or Literaturnost, or the literariness of a text. And to put it simply, it's basically how the distinguishing features of a text make up the text in the way they do. How are they new? So what is it apart from this technique of defamiliarization that makes that gives a text its literary quality, that makes up the literariness of a text, as they say? And this was put forward by Roman Jakobson, who says that this is the object of study of the Russian formalists and of Russian formalism in general, to look at the literariness of a text and how it is constituted. So while defamiliarization focuses on literary devices and how you make familiar things unfamiliar, literariness of a text goes one step further back and looks at how those devices work. So it says that its main focus is how these devices that participate in defamiliarization call themselves to a reader's attention. So perhaps when you see an unusual description or an unusual simile, you might say, well, that's beautiful because that's defamiliarization at work, because you can see how he's using a simile, how a poet is using a simile or a metaphor that is usually not used. But if you were to take a step back and say, well, now what is it about this simile that makes it what it is? How has he used this simile, or why has he picked this particular description to describe this thing instead of another one? And that would constitute literariness. Okay. So Jakobson says that literariness is the way in which the devices of a text call themselves to our attention, and the focus is on how they call themselves to our attention as being new or as being unique. And you also focus on how these literary devices make up a text and how they make up a text differently. So if a simile if a certain simile is used, is a cliched one and is perhaps used 10 times across 10 different texts, and the 11th time it's different, that's what we need to focus on. That's what you need to focus on to see why it's different and how it gives the text its literary character. Okay. So the sole focus of Russian formalism then is just on the text and on the devices itself, not simply on the text but on the devices itself, and it works to keep out psychological, historical and biographical factors, as we've already gone over, but not in too great detail. They're not completely dead set against including historical detail or psychological legacies into their reading, because they realize that these have a role to play. However, when they started out, this is what they were seen as keeping to the end, as we can say, but we'll come to that in a while. Okay, here are a couple of other points about the Russian formalists. Here's one on imagery. So for the Russian formalists, imagery does not characterize literature. The mere use of imagery does not make a work a poem or a piece of literature, as we might commonly assume that it does. For the Russian formalists, it is what use the work makes of imagery that gives a work its literary character. So simply describing the sunlight and how it glints off leaves of a tree, say, uh, and likening it to fire or dying embers or anything that we might commonly associate with sunlight glinting off leaves, is imagery. And if written thus, we would say that yes, it is beautiful and it is probably extremely literary. But for the Russian formalists, it is not simply that. It is what use is made of the imagery. Why is the text using the imagery the way it does? Why is the text talking about sunlight glinting off leaves and in terms of fire or dying embers, let's say? Why is it doing it, and to what end is it doing it? So if those questions have answers, then the text can be said to be literary on account of its imagery, but not if imagery is simply used for flourish. Okay. Another example of looking at literary devices and focusing on how they make up a text would be in poetry or in verse, where you look at the meter, the rhythm, the rhyme, the alliteration, and so many other devices, and you see how they work together to give to produce an effect that it does. It's So verse is different from prose here because all of these features, all of these characteristics that I just mentioned work together to produce one effect. And Paul Fry, who is a lecturer at Yale University, gives a very nice example of I think a children's story called Thomas the Tow Truck. And he starts off with the alliteration in the title itself, and then he looks at the rest of the story, and as he moves throughout the story, he sees that everything is in groups of threes. So there's Thomas the tow truck, which is 3 T's, and then there are 3 of his friends, and there are 3 events that the book talks about, and other things like that, really. But he shows how the significance of the alliteration in the title, Thomas the Tow Truck, and every time that's repeated in the story, it serves to reinforce or re-emphasize the tripartite division in the story. It's a nice example that he gives, and he's done the analysis himself. Yes. Okay. Now, Boris Eichenbaum, who is also a Russian formalist, said that a literary work of art, sorry, that's a spelling error, a literary work of art is made, shaped, invented, not only artful but artificial in a good sense of the word. So he's aware, and all of them are aware, that literary language and poetic language is extremely different from ordinary language, and they realize that it's not simply using imagery and the language for the sake of it, which would be artificial in the bad sense of the word, but it's using these devices to a certain end, to produce a certain effect on the reader, or to emphasize a certain point, or to strengthen perhaps the form of the text. If it's an allegory or verse, then you would use these devices to strengthen it in order to re-emphasize certain points. Therefore, a good literary work of art is not only artful, but artificial in the good sense of the word, that these devices are being used to some end and that they're not simply there for the sake of being there. Okay. Now, before we move on to how Russian formalism ended, I'll give a couple of general points on how the movement progressed as well. So, the Russian formalists were very, very aware that a new art form or a new genre or a new movement like this one, where you emphasize form over content, cannot be divorced from old forms of reading literature, of looking at them, of analyzing them. They're not divorced, and it would do nobody any good to say that they are divorced and to pretend like they are divorced. So they recognize that new art forms derive a lot from old ones, and instead of looking at them as a derivation, they say that new art forms are reorganizations of old art forms. So when an old art form loses its aesthetic value, that's what they say. When an old art form loses its aesthetic value, a new art form comes along or springs up in order to revitalize it or to rework it and tweak it a little bit in order to give it either its old aesthetic value or to give it a new aesthetic value, in which case it would become popular with readers once more. And what they mean by reworking or reorganizing an old art form is that they recognize that certain elements in literature are privileged above others at different points in time, and a reorganization of an art form would simply mean moving these elements up and down in scales of hierarchy. So, for instance, because Russian formalism was a reaction to symbolism and against the metaphysicalness of things, literary language, imagery for the sake of imagery, deep meaning, psychological and historical contexts were all privileged above the written word, the character, and the plot in itself, right? So that these were the elements that were privileged in the previous movement or in the previous art form. But now in Russian formalism, they privilege the form itself above the content of the text, which means that the character is subordinate to the form, the plot, perhaps the author's biographical context is also subordinate to the form, right? However, they also saw, I'll take that again. Literature, in order to renew itself, should periodically draw upon motifs and devices of sub-literary genres like journalism, vaudeville, folk song, detective story, etc. This is a statement made by one of the Russian formalist members, and it's a lovely statement because it reinforces what I was talking about earlier, that they recognize that new art forms are not divorced from old art forms, and that they draw from one another, they reorganize one another, and new ones need, and new art forms need to draw, or in this case he says literature needs to draw from sub-literary genres that are not considered quite literature but that are still there, like folk song, like oral traditions, maybe fairy tales, mythologies, things like that. Literature needs to draw on elements from these genres in order to revitalize itself and in order to give itself a new impetus. This also is a testament to the school's distrust of rigid definitions and hierarchies, because they were trying very hard to break away from it, especially the hierarchies, because that's what prevailed before 1915. And this was a radically new idea that they had come up with at that point of time in their geographical location, which was extremely exciting for them, to look simply at the form and at literary devices and literary tools in the text without being worried about the nuances of plot. Just to repeat a few points, the Russian formalists then were interested in the literariness of a text, in the devices of literature used that delay a reader's arrival at meaning. They're interested in the structure, in the way a text is put together. Now, this interpretation of, or this lens of interpretation that's used on the Russian formalists is that the techniques of defamiliarization that is used, which is making the familiar unfamiliar, to understand what's going on, to understand and appreciate what's going on. Perhaps rather than, if the usual similes are to liken a moon to perfection, beauty, radiance, and so on, and these are similes for the moon, or simply adjectives used to describe the moon, if suddenly someone comes up with a simile that says a moon is, or the rising moon, let's say, or the half moon is like the crescent-shaped, is like the crescent-shaped part of our nails that everybody has, that's closest to the skin. or if they rendered it in more literary language than I just did, then it would take the reader a moment to go, hang on a moment, you were talking about the moon, but the simile being used is about the nail that's closest to our skin, at the bottom part of our nails, really. And that's not something you would expect to see in conjunction with a description of the moon, and it certainly doesn't hold with ideas of that. So it would take the reader just that one extra moment to understand it, and it also enhances your perception of everyday life, because when you read that, you would probably think, oh, I never thought about that. So this is what is meant when it is said that these devices delay a reader's arrival at meaning, because it takes you a while to understand that it's the moon that's being spoken of. But it also teaches you to appreciate, or it also allows you to appreciate everyday perception. It also restructures your everyday perception, and it also makes you attentive to the different features of a text, or how sentences are structured, therefore how a text is put together. Now, going back a couple of points to the new critics are also interested in the same features. They're also interested solely in the text, which means that they're definitely interested in the devices and literary tools used to create meaning in the text. But they see it as enriching the meaning of a text. How? Because it slows you down to get the meaning. So ambiguity is looked upon very kindly by the new critics, and it's inevitable because you're cutting out all forms of external context whatsoever. And if you're cutting out authorial intent, authorial biography, historical circumstances, social and cultural circumstances and contexts, then it means that there's definitely going to be ambiguity when you look at the text solely in itself. But while the new critics look at this delay as a means of enriching the text and of enriching the readers, as a means of enriching the text, the Russian formalists look at it as enriching a reader's perception. That's one point of difference. The formalists, the later formalists, saw no difference between form and content, and to them, this was the basic mistake that the opponents of formalism made, but this was towards the later stages of the movement, perhaps a couple of years before it ended. But they did manage to see that and this is to their testament, because they started out believing that form, or they started out on the premise that form is different from content, and one form and this element of form is privileged above the element of content. However, this is rather in keeping with the new art forms as not divorced from the old ones, about how they see literature as needing to revive itself by drawing from other genres that are not strictly literature, and so on. So you see that they're not completely against that. I'm sorry, I'll take that again. So you see that they're not set on binaries, and perhaps that they never were. See form and content not as very different, certainly not as binary opposites, but they do privilege form over content nonetheless. Okay, let's move on to the end of Russian formalism, or how it drastically came about. This happened in the span of 1 year or less, from 1929 to 30. There was a ban on intellectual debate in the Soviet Union, and therefore formalism too was ended. It was deemed as anti-Marxian. Now, why was it deemed anti-Marxian? Simply because it allowed, or it was believed that it allowed for no space for historical or cultural contexts, and that goes completely against Marxian tenets, which says that all cultural production is the result of historical materialism and of cultural contexts that are present right now and have been present for a while. But because it was seen that Russian formalism did not allow these into play while reading a text, it was banned entirely. And in the 1940s, formalism, not just Russian formalism, but in general the term formalism was used in a rather mocking way, and it wasn't used in a very positive way. It came to acquire a negative connotation, and it came to denote a preoccupation with mere form. Now, this was also seen as a preoccupation with art for the sake of art, or with aesthetics for the sake of aesthetics, which should not go down too well in Soviet Russia in the Soviet Union at that point of time, because the track that they were taking was definitely Marxian and definitely communist, but which also meant that which also perhaps meant that if you had time to sit to look at the aesthetics of a text, or to look at the features of a text simply because you want to see what gives the text the status that it has, then it must mean that you have a lot of time, and it's a very bourgeois activity to do, let's put it that way. So this is a rough, I'll take that again. So this is an overview of how Russian formalism came up, its trajectory, and how it ended. But it's also important to note that as a form of literary criticism, it started out from here, from the Opohas and the Moscow Linguistic Circle, and these were Society for the Study of the Poetic Language and of Linguistics and Poetry, and these were critical endeavors in themselves, and ideas of defamiliarization and literariness are not just revolutionary breakthroughs, so to speak, but there is solidification and perhaps a refining of ideas that had been going on in these circles for quite some time. And it gave a new impetus to how criticism is done, especially defamiliarization, which is even today it's synonymous with the Russian formalists, and it's quite difficult to do as well, and it takes practice. So as a critical endeavor, it truly did open up new avenues, and it has been likened to new criticism a lot, but there are subtle differences between the two, which we've seen. New criticism focuses on pushing out all kinds of context whatsoever, while Russian formalism allows for context but focuses on the devices that are there in a text. It focuses on the language, on the semiotics, and Russian formalism eventually gave rise to ideas of structuralism as well, which is dealt with by Saussure, who is also a linguist. So you can see the continuation of their work through the ages. Okay, thank you.